As we began to play with the 4 economic questions and referring and thinking back to the 5 relationships, we started to look for what did the 4 questions help us see in these 5 relationships, and started to recognize a pattern. And that's the pattern that I want to share with you right now. To show you what we started to see, I want to go back now thinking through these 4 questions: resources, allocation mechanism, value, and organization, about what we see through the 5 primary relationships. And we'll start to elicit the pattern that we're seeing. So we'll start with self. In the relationship to self, when we look at the question, we'll look at these 4 questions. Resources. How much do I see in the world? Now, what we want to be careful with is, here when we describe the relationship to the self, the only thing that's available to me is the self. That's the only way I'm relating to it. That's why we had the relationship to self. I'm only relating to these questions through the self. Now, resources question. When I look at my resources that are available, how much do I see? The how much question. What do I see for me? And what I see is that I either have or I don't. If somebody else has it, then I don't have it. So it's a question of how much do I have in the resources. So for the allocation mechanism, now I see resources, I see how much there is, I see that somebody else has, or I don't have, or I do have. Now it's who makes decisions about how to allocate that. And the only way I can relate to this is through myself. So I should decide for myself. Now likewise, I'm going to assume, we're intelligent human beings, so I say, well, I think you should also decide for yourself, but it's how you decide for yourself. So it's the self deciding. The next question was around value. So we have resources, allocation mechanism, and value. Value is what criteria do I use in the allocation mechanism for these resources that I need for me. And here we see that I would decide that what I want furthers my well-being. I want to feel better. I want to feel more vibrant in the world. And so I make the decisions in the criteria for my well-being. Unfortunately, I'm the only one that knows what I want and what my well-being is, so I'm the one that's most appropriate to decide for the criteria. I decide for me, using this criteria, how to get more resources for myself. The 4th question is around organization. How does this interact with the other relationships? Because, as we said earlier, all of the different ways of looking at interactions, human interactions over time, have always considered all 5 relationships to be important. So now how do we interact with the other group, nature and spirit? From this perspective, what we've already just said was that the only relationship, the only way to relate to this whole experience is through the self. So the best we can do, and what we want to do, is sum up the experience of all the individuals. So the health of all of us is really the sum of each of us. So we're going to organize so a bunch of individuals are out there doing their work individually together, and that we will be better off when all the individuals are doing their own thing. So it's an individual-based system that we aggregate. That just means that we sum up what all the individuals have done, and that's how we see the health of the group, the other, nature, spirit, is through summing up individuals, because that's the only reference point we have. So let's continue this process for the other. when I'm looking at the first question is around resources, and when I'm looking at the other, I'm looking at what you have and what I have, and does it feel fair, and do we each have equal access to the resources that are available to us? So in the allocation mechanism, we should each have a say of what is fair and equal to us. Again, all we have here to relate to the experience and the relationship to the other is that relationship between me and you. So we have to always bring only that to the question when we're trying to address these 4 questions. So we said in the resources it's fair and equal access to the resources. And here we said, well, we each want to have a say in how we're going to allocate those resources. And the value that we place on that is one of fairness and balance. Because that's what we care about. We really care, does it feel like you and I are equally and fairly being able to have access to this thing that we want, and the way that we each have a say in that. The organization question here about how do we interact is we're seeking a system of justice, of fairness, of balance, so that we each have fair and equal access to the resources that we need and that we value. So now you get the idea. Let's look at the group. Answering the same 4 questions. So for the group, we have what are the resources available? And from only the group mentality, we see, hey, this group has resources, or it doesn't. How much do we have as a group? Allocation mechanism, how do we decide? We decide as a group. What do we value? We value the well-being or the health of the group. And how do we organize the interactions of the different relationships? And here we're looking towards the group and asking the question, what can the individuals do to contribute to the group? Excellent. The next relationship we looked at was nature. When we look into nature, what do we see? When we look at the resources, we find that each of the members or individuals or small groups compete with others to get the resources they need to survive. The decision-making process, now this is a little funny to think of the allocation mechanism and the nature process, but we actually have a very evolved one. What we think about, or have understood today, in the allocation mechanism in a relationship to nature is that evolution finds the most resilient solutions that have evolved to allow one to continue to find the resources they need to survive. So we have natural selection. of the most resilient solutions. And in this relationship, what we're looking for is resilience. We value resilience in the ability to adapt and evolve to the changes in an ecosystem that's constantly evolving, and selecting those that are more resilient to get those resources. So when, from the nature relationship, we think about the other relationships, what we're looking to do is optimize our resiliency and balance within the ecosystem. So now let's look at the relationship to spirit. So with spirit, now we want to look at these 4 questions. Resources. From our relationship to the creative source, to spirit, when we look out into the world, we look at, do we have access to this source? Do we have access to the creativity that's showing up in our lives in all of its different forms, from material to immaterial, to tangible to intangible? The allocation mechanism is who decides. That's that second question. And the person or the force that decides is the creative source. Based on what value? What is the value system that we put in place, or the criteria we're using to how sources deciding how to allocate the resources that we have access to, is closeness to the source. We've looked at this in a variety of different ways to say closeness to source, whether you think of this as just creativity, you think this is creativity everywhere, you think of this as spirit, it's a God, it's whatever relationship you have to the source of creativity. And all of these ways of looking at it through our relationship to the spirit or the source of creativity, it's always an approximation to ever closer relationship to that spirit. Then the organization is about optimizing the experience of source. What are the multiple ways that we relate to our experience? Source of creativity. So now what we're looking at with all 5 of these, and I hope all 5 of these made sense. Again, it was just going back to the 5 primary relationships and looking at these now 4 questions that we have and seeing what would we say when we looked at these. And as I started a few minutes ago with what we started to do when applying these 4 questions, these economic questions that everybody's asked, what do we have? How do you decide how to allocate those, on what criteria, and then how do you do that with other relationships? When we went through these 5 relationships, we started to realize that we were describing major systems that do exist out there, and that these are the basic premises underneath different approaches to the world. So now that we have all these pieces, and again, I hope all of these pieces make sense, and starting to see if there's a pattern across these. And asking the question, what happens when we say the self is the primary relationship through which we engage in the world? And this starts to look about, well, it's all about me. I am the one who decides based on my own well-being or the utility that I get from something, in a system that's based on a bunch of individuals deciding, and that starts to sound a lot like neoliberal capitalism. which is also known as market-based capitalism or economics. Right? And here, just for our own remembering, the word liberal in there is from the word liberate, liberty. So it's about freedom of the individual. So it's an individual's way of looking at how do we interact as a group of individuals within a marketplace. So really, while each of these economic systems tries to appreciate and include some of these other factors, we'll give them that, the predominant way of talking about it and what the most important thing is one of giving primacy to one of these relationships. So likewise, when we look at the other, is there an economic system out there based on the premise of it's got to be fair and equal, that we each have a say in participating, so it's a participatory process for engaging in what's fair and equal to each of us in a balanced and just way for us to find this equality. And we find that very much in the pluralist or socialist societies. And I'm going to make a very quick distinction between what are the political manifestations, whether the group took up autocratic ways of doing it, imposing on societies, whether they were clean to what they actually intended or not, is different than the question we're asking. The basic premise of a pluralist society or socialist economics is around finding this equality. The primary focus on the individual in the markets is the belief that the individual is the primary relationship. In the group, again, we found, where do they say it's all about the group? We decide as a group for the group's well-being, and then the individuals and all these other things are as they serve the group. And this is very much in the collectivist society or communities. And one of those manifestations is commune. What we have in common, that which we share, is where the word community, communist, comes from, community. So thinking of the collectivist system, we have communist economics, which again places primacy on this relationship. Now we have in the same with nature. In nature we have a focus on being in balance, surviving in the ecosystem, finding the most resilient, evolving solutions to coexisting within. And these naturalist systems have evolved into different forms of ecological economics. All based on these relationships to nature. And finally, we look at, is there anybody out there who says it's all about access to source, the creative being, the source of creativity, and getting closer to that and optimizing our experience of that. And the spiritual based or theocratic economics. In the theocratic, theo just means God or source or creativity based economic systems. So it turns out when you go to look at the data and you look at subfields called comparative economics, which exist within all of these systems, they start to distinguish that there are major blocks of humanity that over the last hundreds of years have really focused on very different systems. And what becomes interesting for us to start exploring is, one, what if these 5 relationships that we said from chapter 1 is just based on our experience? We had people say, what is your experience of low vibrancy and high vibrancy groups? And what is the difference in those? And people described their experience of how they relate to that experience and its vibrancy through these 5 relationships. Well, what if it turns out that when you get to these 4 economic questions, that people are basing their answers based on the relationship that they held to be most primary? Beautiful, because that sets us up for the paradox of we're finding that none of these solutions, which each promise to get us to the end, this system says that if you want to be a highly vibrant human being, that you got to do it primarily through this relationship and the rest will work. And this group says the same, and these groups say the same, and so do these and these. And none of them is achieving it, and the systems are falling apart or having great challenges to their own growth. And they're starting to say that the problem isn't that these other relationships are important. The problem is that we're spending time on these other relationships. So maybe for the self to really work, we need to stop doing these other things. So the problem with these different, the challenge that each of these different groups has is, while they've learned many things over the last couple centuries about what really works within their system, they're finding that their system doesn't achieve the well-being that they promised. And not only are they not suggesting, they're not suggesting that we need to figure out how to integrate these other perspectives. They're actually starting to come to the point where we're not achieving the greater well-being, however we define that value, because we're paying attention to these other relationships, and that in fact we need to stop paying attention to those. If we go back to the initial conversation, the initial exploration of your own experience as you felt it, when you looked at the low vibrancy and the high vibrancy, you said in the high vibrancy that all were present. If you remember, we had the inner circle, the middle circle, and the outer circle. And we said in the outer circle, high vibrancy experience, all 5 were present. Now each of these systems says that the other 4 are not available to it and aren't really valuable. That's why they put primacy on one of them. So the question is, if we want to get away from the inner circle to the middle or outer circle, and each of these systems has promised to be able to get there, focusing on just one relationship, and it's not working, then the question is, what can we do? And what we started to find, again from your own experience, was living in that outer circle had all 5. This presents a problem. The reason we focus on each one of these is because we found over thousands of years, we philosophers, practitioners, people in many different disciplines, that human beings aren't very good at doing 5 things at once. We're really good at doing one thing, one objective. So that's why we focused on one of these and have learned a lot in each of these. And there are wars that we fight against these different systems, as you'll recognize. So the question is, if we want to get to the outer circle, which requires all 5, and staying within one isn't working, then how do you get to all 5 if we can't pay attention to 5 things at once? And what we started to find in your own experience was that you're not paying attention to each of these relationships, rather you're paying attention to one thing, and that was the vibrancy. What is the harmonic vibrancy that I experience in this group? And that these are only 5 different ways of relating to that experience of the harmonic vibrancy. So the trick is to deal with all 5 at the same time. It's listening to the harmonic and the vibrancy, because as you're engaged in the harmonic and relating to the harmonic, you're relating to all 5 relationships at the same time. You're able to listen to, in the harmonic, myself, to you, to the group, to what's emerging from possibility into reality, and the creativity as it manifests everywhere, all at once. So you're doing one thing, achieving all 5. So as we begin to move forward, the question is twofold. What is it that enables us to learn from all of these different systems? So we should celebrate that people have spent centuries living within each of these systems and learned a lot about what works and doesn't work when you put primacy on each of these relationships. So we want to learn from them, and we want to learn from groups that are living in that outer vibrancy circle to figure out how they're doing it, so that we can design a system that engages the best of each of these responses to the 4 questions, but in the way that it's not trying to do it through 5 things at once, rather the one thing, the harmonic vibrancy. So the question becomes, what is the harmonic vibrancy response to the 4 questions?